So hi guys, welcome to this lecture today. So today I plan to discuss India's agrarian crisis with you. I would like to share a lot of details as to why India faces the problem that it currently faces. So in today's lecture, what I'm trying to do is instead of like focusing on, let's say, the specific schemes run by the government or the specific issues within those schemes, what I'll try to do in this particular lecture is give you a background as to why there is an agriculture crisis in India. Is it something which the present government has done? Is it something that can be blamed on the governments in the past? Was there an alternative to this? And I'll also try to present a counterfactual in the sense that had we taken some steps that other, let's say, economies of, let's say, similar scale and similar, let's say, position as we had in history, if we had followed the same route, could we have seen India in a better place vis-a-vis agriculture? Now, obviously, there are a lot of factors outside of the domain of agriculture that will affect how economy is run, etc. I'll try to cover that as well. So I'd like to begin by talking about and giving you a brief background as to the history of agriculture in India. Okay. So as we realized, by the time we became independent, agriculture was in dire straits, and basically we had a situation wherein we had to rely on import of food grains from the developed world to to feed our people, right? So it's in this context that the first 5-year plans, etc., started working, and this is the sort of challenge that the first sovereign government of first democratically elected sovereign government of India faced. So at that point of time, the primary issue was of food security, right? And to ensure that people have enough food to eat, the government at that point of time tried to look at something which is now labeled as the Green Revolution. Okay. Um, so in the ninth, so as actually prior to the Green Revolution, what initially happened was as soon as we became independent in the 1950s, the government at that point of time thought that the sort of agrarian crisis we saw in India at that point of time was basically a result of, let's say, the existing zamindari practices, etc., prevailing at that point of time. So the initial idea of the government was to carry forward and carry out a series of land reforms, and it thought that if these land reforms are adequately carried out, a lot of the problems that Indian agriculture has been facing could be easily tackled with. So in terms of land reforms, initially right after independence, what the government did was initially it talked about abolition of the intermediaries, right? So the way that land holdings were structured in India, there were a lot of sharecroppers, tenants, etc., who were tilling the land, but the ownership of the land was with the elite landholding classes. And the governments believed that this skewed relationship between these two classes and the sort of oppressive system that existed at that point of time was responsible for a lot of India's agrarian problems. So this started with land reforms, which began with the abolition of intermediaries, right? So basically, at the time of independence, about more than half, around 57-58% of the agricultural land was under the zamindari system. Okay. And after independence, a lot of legislations were passed to make sure that modern India does away with this age-old traditional evil of the zamindari system. Okay. So the first one came in with regards to the first one was the abolition of the intermediaries. Okay. Then you had a lot of tenancy reforms, which basically said that there has to be a regulation of the rent in terms of the sort of rent that the tenant croppers in those lands were made to pay. And the government tried to restrict the rent to not more than 1/4 or 1/5 of the produce. Okay. Because traditionally the rates had been very high and the zamindars were basically exploiting these landless serfs. So then the government also tried to bring in reforms such as, let's say, security of tenure. It ensured that the zamindars could not evict the people, and it gave certain rights to the tenants who were farming in those lands, right? Um, then came a very important piece of legislation, which was the land sealing laws. And land sealing laws also, if you look at India if you look at the land sealing laws, there was a turmoil that it unleashed in the society. Obviously, if you have land sealing laws and if you suddenly wake up one day and tell the people that you own so much land that we want to take this land away from you and we want to redistribute it to other people, so obviously there would be a furor and uprising in the land holding classes. And that's basically what we saw in the 1970s, right? So in 1972 the land sealing laws came in, and the government basically directed most of the states to have their own land, have to come up with land sealing laws, which basically said that beyond a certain limit, you cannot hold those lands. So the idea behind this was fairly good. It was meant to ensure that a lot of people get land. Some like so uh, approximately, let's say 90. So a lot of people at that point of time didn't have land, and the government tried to redistribute this land. So a lot of land was given to erstwhile landless farmers who had already been tilling on these lands. So these lands were taken away from the zamindar. Now the problem is that this happened in 1972. However, a lot of issues that we see in Indian agriculture today are a direct result of this land sealing act. And before I continue with this lecture on Indian agrarian problems, I would like to say that the sort of problems that we see today in agriculture in India are a result of the policies that we have undertaken in the past. And I'm not saying that these policies are wrong. These policies made a lot of sense when these were formulated. These acts and the laws that govern agriculture made a lot of sense at that point of time. But Indian agriculture is a victim of good intentions and unintended consequences of these policies. Okay, I'm not saying that these policies are wrong when they were brought in at that point of time. But what happens in India is that if you bring in a policy and that policy, let's say, sort of grants any small favors or any small advantages to people, and after a time the state realizes that there is no point in continuing with these advantages, it is very hard for any of the governments to roll back these specific particular policies, because then there emerges issues of vote banks. Because of the sheer number of people in India, any and every policy will have multiple effects on multiple sections and segments of the society. And once you bring in a policy, it is very, very hard to roll back those policies. So a lot of policies that government of India bought back then, if we could somehow roll them back, a lot of the issues that we see could be solved. Okay. So this is the background with regards to the immediate reforms that were carried out. But then India being India, we are a very Jugadu nation. We as usual came up with a lot of ways to circumvent these land sealing laws, etc. Right? For example, this was the first time that a lot of people started granting properties to their wife. Right? Let's say if the government comes up and says that a person A can only hold, let's say, 100 acres of land. Now, somebody who owns 1,000 acres of land will transfer 100 acres of land to his wife, 100 acres of land to his brother. So on paper, they would say that it's a divided family, but in reality, they would be sharing the same household, and they would be partaking in the profits from agricultural cultivation in those areas. So these things happened. And then obviously, whenever any land was grabbed by the state, the constitution gives you the right to appeal to the judiciary, and people filed cases in the high courts, etc. And during the time the courts put the stay on litigation these matter, a lot of benami transactions took place, right? So benami transaction is basically when, let's say, I have 1,000 acres of land, and I can legally own only 100 acres of land. What I'll do is I will find someone, let's say maybe like a poor person in a village who I have total absolute control over, some serf that I have in my village, somebody whose family has been like a cultivator for me for the last 200 years, and I have sort of absolute social control over this person. So I will name him the owner of 100 acres of land on paper. So on paper, that guy owns 100 acres of land, but effectively that land is my land. So these sort of benami transactions took place, and the government's intention with regards to so the intentions again were very good with regards to the land sealing act. But Indians, being the sort of jugadu people we circumvented these, right? So after this, in the 1960s, we faced a huge problem of food shortages, and we were reduced to a very, very bad state, in the sense that we had to appeal to foreign nations to give food to us. And this is the time when United States of America donated wheat to us, but that wheat was like of a very low quality, and that wheat was basically what was being fed to cattle in the US. So in the 1960s, the issue that we had was of food security. Our people were forced to eat cattle grade grain meat because we just didn't have food to feed our people, right? So the Indian government looked westwards, and in the mid 1960s, there is this very important person named Professor Norman Borlaug. I think, as preparing for CLAT, you should know this person. He is called the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug. Okay, so in the 1960s, he developed a high yielding variety of seeds in Mexico. So in the Kharif season of 1966, India launched the HYV high yield variety program in India under the leadership of Swaminathan, MS Swaminathan. So MS Swaminathan is known as the father of the Green Revolution in India. Okay. Now, so under the Green Revolution, the sort of gains that we made were immense in the sense that we were able to produce a lot of food and we were able to tackle the challenge of food security. So this was a policy gone right. But then we had unintended consequences of the Green Revolution, which plague us today. For example, under the Green Revolution, there was, let's say, the areas of Punjab and Haryana and Western Uttar Pradesh where irrigation networks etc. were well developed, and it was easier for farmers there to take advantage of the Green Revolution. These areas prospered. Okay, so these areas provided enough food to people, but then it promoted a sense of regionalism in the country, and the sort of areas that you today see wherein there is left-wing extremism, the Maoist areas, these areas and these people in these areas could not benefit at all from the Green Revolution. It gave impetus to anti-national and secessionist forces like Maoists, etc., to operate in this area, right? So this was one intended consequence. And another unintended consequence was, in order to feed India, states like Punjab and Haryana started growing rice. Now, if you're generally aware of history, people in Haryana and Punjab did not have rice as a part of their normal diet because Haryana and parts of Punjab are fairly arid regions, right? And rice is a highly water intensive crop. So because of irrigation networks, because of, let's say, free or subsidized electricity provided to the farmers started digging up water, and they started depleting the underground, they started depleting the water table. So at one end you're producing rice and you're feeding people. However, then instead of being the net promote exporter of rice, states like Punjab and Haryana have effectively become net exporters of water, and water is the resource that these states don't really have. So this was another unintended consequence of the Green Revolution. So as I told you earlier, in this sort of presentation that I'm making, I'll be telling you basically how, like, there were certain policies that were very good, they had very good intentions, but India is a victim. Indian agriculture in specificity is a victim of these good intentions and unintended outcomes of these policies. Okay, so this is basically the background that I wanted to give before I look at the sort of problems that agriculture faces in India today. So I hope that you have a fairly decent idea of the sort of problems that we have. Now, coming to the present day, I would like to give you some facts and figures so that you are able to appreciate the scale of the crisis that we see today. Okay, one second. So if you look at the economic survey of 2019, agriculture supports about 58% of India's population, okay? But its share in the GDP is only 16.5%. So for those who don't know what GDP is, because when I was in 12th, I didn't know what GDP is. Effectively, GDP is the final cumulative value of all the final products produced in an economy, right? So it's a measure of how good your country is doing in terms of the money and the value of money it is producing, right? So agriculture today, it supports around 60% of the population, but its share in the GDP is only 16.5%. So if you think logically, it basically says that 58% of the people are making only 16.5% of the money in this country, right? So obviously, if you have such a skewed ratio, then there is a problem that's going to exist in society. These people will effectively be poor. Now, if you look at the rates, let's say, of people partaking in agriculture in, let's say, Europe or the United States, it's about 2 to 3 to 4%. And even though GDP contributes to, let's say, 5 or 6% of the GDP in those countries, it doesn't matter because the population that is also deriving its livelihood out of agriculture is much smaller, right? So therefore, the problem of poverty of farmers, etc., doesn't really exist at such. I mean, there are obviously issues in every country, but the scale of the problem is really amplified in India. Okay. Uh, So if you look at these numbers, then it becomes fairly clear that why it has happened is that over a period of years, the development process that India has seen, right? And we look at India and we say, oh, what an admirable growth story. Now, this growth story has left behind a very important sector, that is agriculture. So a lot of growth is ascribed to non agriculture sector, right? And a lot of those the structural changes that took place in the economy took place in these non-agriculture sectors, and the wisdom of the governments of that day was to protect, let's say, agriculture from any sort of influences. Even when India became liberalized in 1991, the governments of the day decided that we need to protect agriculture and we don't want liberalization in agriculture as well. So effectively, what that has sort of led to is that as per government data in the economic survey of 2017, if you look at the average income of farmers from 17 states in India, the 17 poorest states in India, their average income is 20,000 rupees. Now 20,000 rupees per year is less than, most likely less than the cost of the device that you're watching this video on, right? So that's the scale of the agricultural crisis in India. There are families of farmers, like 4 people, 5 people, 6 people, who are surviving somehow on less than 20,000 rupees a year. So this is where our prime minister's speech becomes very important when he says that we really need to work towards uplifting these farmers, and we really need to work towards doubling the farmers income. Now, however, think about it this way: even if you double somebody's income from 20,000 rupees to 40,000 rupees a year, I mean, obviously it'll make a large difference to that person, but still that's not the sort of development that we want to see. We want the farmers to have way more money than this, right? So let me quantify in terms of, let's say, uh, how far behind we've left our farmers, and how developments in the non-agricultural sectors have basically ignored any sorts of developments in the agriculture sector. So if you take the year 1970, the minimum support price for wheat was 76 rupees per quintal. So guys, minimum support price, we'll talk about it in detail later, is basically the price which the government sells before production and harvesting. Thus it says that irrespective of how much wheat and rice you produce, I will give you this much money if you give me this amount of rice, right? So this is the MSP in 1970. The MSP was 76 rupees per quintal. Okay. And in 2015, the MSP was fixed as at 1450 rupees per quintal. Now, this over this period of 45 years is an increase in 19 times, right? However, most of us who are watching this video probably are not from this startup society who actually cares about the minimum support price. I will come to the more important parameter that you'll be able to identify. If you look at the same period, the basic salary plus dearness allowance of government employees. Now, mind you that the farmers' income and MSP were raised by 19 times, but the salary and DA of government employees were raised by 120 to 150 times. And if you're a college or a university lecturer, your increase in income was 150 to 170 times. Okay. School teachers by 280 to 320 times. And if you're a corporate employee in the 1975, and if you're a corporate employee today, the difference in income could be from 300 times to 1000 times, right? Now, this is fairly shameful if you look at the sort of increase in income that we provided to farmers, which is just 20 times the increase in the last 45 years. If you compare that to someone whose income in the corporate sector has grown by, let's say, a factor of 1000, then that's a problem. It breeds inequality in the society. Okay. So now I'd like to focus on some particular heads and give you an idea of the sort of crisis we face and the sort of deep structural problem that we have with agriculture, right? So in this video, as I told you before, what I'll do is I'll give you a conceptual, I will explain to you in detail, and I'll explain to you the concepts behind the agrarian crisis. Now, I'm assuming that if you're a serious aspirant preparing for CLAT, you're also reading newspapers on the go. And I believe what sort of government schemes the government has come up, it'll come up with a lot of schemes in the future. It has come up with a lot of schemes in the budget, etc. I believe that you could find that very easily online in any of those resource materials, etc. provided to you. I think the focus of this video should be to look at the root causes of the agrarian crisis, but you can give your feedback later. And if you want videos with specific data points and with more focus on stuff that is most likely to come in your exam, in the sense that specific data, specific names, etc., please give an adequate feedback, and then we'll adjust the next lecture accordingly. Okay. So if you look at capital, now the major issue is that the sort of policy making that India has seen since independence, and especially after liberalization, now we've had a lot of economic reforms. Our middle class has grown. We have become a very service oriented economy. Like the service sector in India is thriving. But the beneficiaries of this economic growth have been the urban middle classes and the export markets, right? And any sort of direct economic links between agriculture and the rest of the economy have been weakening for a long time. Now, initially, when we got independent, the linkages between, let's say, the economy and agriculture were very, very close and very visible. Because let's say, for example, in 1960s, the green revolution came through, then the farmers' income rose, and people got food to eat, obviously, and the farmers' income rose. And because farmers' income rose, farmers started buying tractors, they started buying TVs, they started buying radios, etc. So domestic consumption demand also increased with the improvement in agriculture, right? So agricultural economy at that point of time was greatly interlinked with the regular non-agricultural economy. But what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years, it really doesn't matter. In my agricultural economy has basically been delinked, right? So now we are talking about farmers whose average annual income is 20,000 rupees, and you guys who are a part of the non-agricultural economy, you're watching this on 20,000 rupee devices minimum. And probably some of you are sitting in Macs, etc., and watching this. So obviously there is a complete mismatch and complete delinking of the agricultural economy with the non-agricultural economy, and this is very visible in the when we look at the sort of capital that is required for let's say fostering any sort of economic growth. So initially all those extra surplus capital would come out of the surplus in agriculture, but right now we have as in, let's say if you're an Indian corporate today, the way that you get loans is you borrow from banks, you borrow from governments, and you're also allowed to borrow from foreign institution investors. But if you're a farmer in India today, you're really not allowed to borrow from anyone. And even if you're allowed to borrow from anyone, the system is such that it creates a lot of systemic hurdles for you. I will explain to you the hurdles in the coming few slides. Okay. Now, another issue that we saw with agriculture is that India opened up in 1991. We liberalized almost everything, but somehow we chose to not liberalize agriculture, right? So, our agriculture was not liberalized. It wasn't real, as in the agriculturalists and the farmers could not reap the benefits of agriculture, of liberalism, but they had to face the brunt of liberalism in the sense that India opened its own markets to agricultural products from abroad, right? So even today, India right now spends a lot of money to import pulses. Okay. Now, if let's say, as in, it's not making a lot of sense because India is also the country that wastes about 20 to 30 million tons of food grains every year. Every year there's a report that there will be one picture of people starving and people dying, and then there'll be a picture of food grains rotting in godowns, right? So this is a sort of paradox that we live in India, and this is because of a lot of systemic problems that I'll highlight. Okay. So effectively what has happened is, if you look at, let's say, the sort of capital structure that exists around agriculture and the non-agricultural economy, agriculture has basically lost its importance as a provider of capital for industrialization. Now capital is available from basically everywhere else except agriculture. Then agriculture is not providing cheap raw materials and food, right? Because food is also being imported, raw materials are also being imported from multiple countries, and agriculture is no more the market for industrial goods, because the people who are purchasing a lot of industrial goods have nothing to do with agriculture. All of us sitting here on our laptops consuming Wi-Fi enabled internet have nothing to do with agriculture, and we are the primary market for goods. The farmers are not, because they don't have money, right? अगर आपके 20,000 रुपए आपको साल में मिल रहा है, आप क्या ही market बना पाओगे? Like, what is your sort of importance in this market economy? So that's the sad reality that we live in. Now, another very interesting issue is with regards to public investment. Okay, so there are two types of investment. One is public investment, wherein the government spends money, and therefore you have, like, public schools means government schools, public hospital means government run and government funded hospitals, right? So that is one model. The other model of investment is the private investment model. Okay, so there is a beautiful essay in the Journal of Agrarian Change by Mr. Ramesh Chand, and he makes a very obvious statement in the sense that he collects a lot of data, and he basically says that public investment in agriculture has halved since the mid 1980s. However, private investment did not come in and to sufficiently make for up for this, right? So let's say the government of India was putting 100 rupees in 1980. It is today putting an equivalent of 50 rupees, and the private sector, which was supposed to put in 50 rupees and even more, is actually putting in less. So the effective, let's say, an equivalent of, let's say, 60 to 65 rupees is being pumped into agriculture, as opposed to 100 when most of the investment was being made by the government, right? So the private sector, see the private sector, why will the private sector invest in agriculture? Private sector ko samaj seva nahi karni na. Private sector has to make profits. Now obviously if you have an agricultural system where there are no profits, then you will obviously not invest. Like let's say I have 100 rupees, I have to invest in the stock market, and I see a company which has not made profit for the last 50 years, I am not investing in that company, right? So that's a fairly obvious thing. So the government can say that we are, let's say, reducing the share of public investment, but at the same time it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that there are adequate incentives for the private sector to come in. The private sector should also have a decent return on investment. It's only then that the private sector would want to come in. Okay, now this is the issue in the sense that the public investment has waned and private investment didn't pick up. Now even with the sort of public investment that is there in agriculture, that is also fairly problematic, right? So what happened is, during the green revolution, the most of the benefits were reaped by the large landowners and people who owned medium, let's say, sized land, had land holding. Now, these are obviously a minority of farmers, right? But these farmers have now become a very powerful lobby. Now so obviously, since the sort of country that we are, politics basically decides not in our country, in every country basically politics decides everything, right? So these farmer lobbies now have a very solid vote bank, and they are very specific in the sense that they can basically issue threats to the state governments that आप ऐसा कर दो, अगर आप ऐसा नहीं कर दोगे तो जो दूसरे सीएम थे वो पिछले साल जो थे हम उनको दोबारा वोट दे देंगे, because he is willing to do these things. So there are two types of investments that you can also make. So अगर मेरे पास 100 रुपए हैं as government, I can invest it in two ways. One, I say stuff like, ठीक है, I'll invest it in short term gratificatory measures. Let's say I will say, okay, I will buy all the rice produced by you for 80 rupees. Now this is effectively how MSP works. The other alternative that I have is that I will not, let's say I will leave you to the free market, I will not buy crops from you, but I will use that 100 rupees to dig canals, I will use that 100 rupees to make sure that there are research facilities in those areas, I will invest to you and your fields regularly, and I pay them salaries so they can advise you better. Now the problem here is, obviously this is the most rational thing to do, but if you look at India, a politician's lifespan is only 5 years, right? And that's because elections happen every 5 years. But that's also a problem, because in India, if you have, let's say, elections in 28 states over 5 years, there is effectively 5 to 6 elections happening in India every year. Okay, and as you know, the sort of political structure that we live in, the power is mostly concentrated in the top heads of the party, and obviously they have to keep all of these things at the back of their head while making electoral and political calculations. So this is also one of the reasons that so-called bold initiatives and let's say schemes could not be launched, because that would mean a short-term agitation by these farmers, and a short-term agitation means 2 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, 8 months, and by the time you could lose a few states in between. So this is also an issue that we see in the Indian state. Okay. And then if you look at the policy of minimum support price also is only helping a very specific chunk of elite farmers, right? So under the green revolution, basically states of Haryana, Punjab and western UP prospered, and then you have MSP there on wheat, rice and sugarcane, and to some extent you have states like Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu where you have MSP on rice. Okay, now the state effectively always declares MSP on 24 products, but effectively what happens in practice is that 18 products are ignored and only 6 products are those wherein the state actually spends money in procuring these crops from farmers, right? So a lot of, once again, so crops like cotton, oil seed, etc. in other states, okay, these get completely left out, and because the support prices for these soils are very low, and then there is a lower incentive for people to grow those crops. Now another unintended consequence of the minimum support price list is that, so the government said that these are 24 25 products that I believe that farmers are generally investing in, right? Because you also have to see a farmer as a businessman, right? You have to give them that sort of intelligence, and you have to expect them to, as in you have to give them that sort of an agency, and you don't have to make patronizing decisions for themselves. You have to respect them as businessmen, and if you do that, then you assume that the farmer is a rational person, right? So if the state today says that I am declaring MSP on 24 products, and the state effectively then only
is able to execute MSPs effectively for 6 products, then obviously farmers all across the country will try to focus on those 6 products itself. Now, this is creating a nutritional crisis in this country, because over the years, with globalization and with development, what we're also seeing in terms of nutrition is that the people's diets are becoming very monolithic. Like, people are eating the same food across the country, people are eating the same food across the world, and it's so there are a lot of nutritional deficiencies that we are seeing. And that's the reason why, let's say, so green revolution basically fed people had rice and wheat in their stomachs, but rice and wheat do not provide essential nutrition, right? So you had people who are surviving, but then at the same time you had people who were stunted, who were malnourished, their mental faculties couldn't develop properly. And that in some way contributes to, let's say, the sort of employment crisis also that we see today, because a lot of surveys say that a lot of the Indian youth is unemployable. And they're unemployable because, like, nutrition does play a very, so the first 5 years of a child's life, nutrition really does play a very important role in terms of the sort of mental faculties that can develop. And if you've just been fed wheat and rice, because that's basically what the government has, because that's the only thing that it is effectively procuring under the minimum support price, and the incentive to produce other crops are eliminated. So the state can only feed you with wheat and rice. And if the state is feeding you with wheat and rice, there is a severe limitation on the sort of intellectual growth that you can achieve. And that's one of the reasons why a large section of the youth is considered to be unemployable. So these are the sort of unintended consequences that I'm talking about. Okay. Now, while we are talking about the issue of public investments, I want to focus a little more on the issue of the minimum support price. Okay. So minimum support price, I think I've fairly explained to you, is the price that the government sets. It says that it tells the farmers before harvesting and before the sowing season that irrespective of what your output is, irrespective of what the market conditions is, this is the amount of money that I will pay you if you give me this much wheat, rice, or any of the 24 items that I mentioned. Okay. Now, initially, the idea of MSP is very good, because the idea of MSP was to make sure that since a lot of farmers in India are producing these wheat, rice, etc., and let's say if there are any, let's say if there is any sort of market distortions, if there are fall in prices, etc., so we need to protect these poor farmers from the fall in these prices. So the government came in with a very good intention that MSP is very nice. I will make sure that I buy this stuff from you, and the procurement under MSP is open-ended. So the government will have, as long as you can give rice and wheat to the government can never say no. It can't say, "Ab mera quota full ho gaya, I will not buy anything more from you." If you are able to find that government officer who's supposed to buy from you, and if you are able to hand him that product, he is supposed to buy it from you at the minimum support price, right? So this was supposed to help out the farmers. Okay. However, the issue that became was that MSP was supposed to be something which was supposed to be protective. However, because of the Green Revolution, some farmer groups who were growing these crops became dominant, and they pressurized the government to make sure that MSPs were set higher than the market price, right? So let's say the market price of rice in India currently is, let's say, 80 rupees per kg, hypothetically, right? And the government says that, so the farmers have pressurized the government to declare the MSP of rice at 100 rupees, right? So all the farmers are incentivized to produce rice, because they know that irrespective of what the market rate is, there is some sort of security, okay, in terms of, let's say, the sort of money that I will get. However, if let's say the MSP didn't exist, then the choice would be left to the farmers, and the farmers would then do some market studies and field studies and realize, अच्छा, पिछले season में प्याज का दाम ये था, पिछले season में टमाटर का दाम ये था. So maybe if I, let's say, diversify, let's say 70% में मैं rice से उगाऊं, but in the 30% let me try with some other thing. So the farmers could take certain risks out of that and maybe diversify his income. Let's say there is a failure of rice crops, there is a glut in the demand for rice crop, that suddenly the price of onions is shooting up. So obviously the farmer could then use market forces and sort of hedge his or her risk, right? But that didn't exist because the farmer lobby was fairly strong, and they have basically forced states like Haryana and Punjab to declare a very high MSP on these goods. Now, because there is very high MSP on these products, states which have traditionally not grown these products are growing rice and wheat, right? So as I highlighted earlier, the problem with growing rice in Haryana and Punjab is that there is as in these states are becoming a net exporter of water. Then these products also require heavy use of fertilizer. So the land over by because of excessive irrigation and because of excessive fertilizer use, the per square kilometer per hectare yield is also decreasing over the years. So the land is also becoming less productive. And these are the sort of unintended consequences that we are seeing, right? And on top of that, it is not that the MSP is a very effective, let's say, mechanism, right? Because MSP, as I told you, is declared on 24 crops. Effectively, the government ends up procuring only six of them, and that also in a very limited manner. So the actual number of farmers who benefit out of MSP is effectively 5 to 6% of the farmers, anyways. So 95% of the farmers don't really benefit from MSPs, anyways, right? So remember I talked to you about two sorts of investments that you can have here. Is one is in the short term gratificatory measures like MSP, and the other would be long term capital investment, right? So let's say only 5 to 6% of the farmers are okay. So let's say it costs 1,000 rupees for the state to buy all of these rice and wheat under the MSP scheme, right? But the only 5 to 6% of the farmers are benefiting out of it, and these are the farmers who are already fairly rich, right? They are rich, they have good social contacts, they have good, let's say, hold and influence, and these are the only ones that are able to sell to the government. Now, instead of this, if the government spent that 1,000 rupees in, let's say, creating ponds in villages, in, let's say, bringing scientists to these villages to advise these farmers to make sure that they grow different types of crops and give them effective training on advanced farming practices, introduce certain kinds of technologies to these fields, okay, then the outputs generally would be better and more farmers could be benefited, right? However, because of the pressure of these farmer lobbies, a lot of investment, a lot of money is being wasted in schemes like the MSP. Okay. Then you have the issue with irrigation in India. So according to the economic survey of 2017, only 33.9% of the total cropped area is irrigated, right? Rest of the area is effectively working ram bharose ki agar barish aa gayi to bahut badhiya, we will have a good yield, right? So somebody has effectively also said that the actual finance minister of India is the monsoon, right? Because your budget is also decided by how much it rains. If there's a good monsoon, then the government predicts that the farmers will be able to sell these goods better. There will be a general, let's say, uh, I know there'll be a jovial economy, and people will have more money to spend. And if the monsoon is bad, then they also automatically make adjustments in the budget in terms of the, let's say, the sort of investment that they'll have to make, the sort of taxes that they'll be able to collect. So now, obviously, it is very logical to say that irrigation facilities have to be provided. Like you can't have irrigation for 40% of the cropped area and let 60% of the land be ram bharose, right? Like you have to have irrigation, this thing, irrigation canals, etc., have to be created. Now, one of the schemes that government of India currently, and not currently, it's been in the pipeline, is that they want to work on the interlinking of rivers. Now, interlinking of rivers, I suggest, is something that you read separately also. But what basically they're saying is that a lot of water from a lot of these large rivers is draining into the Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, anyways. And there are a lot. So they are saying that India is one such country where there are droughts and then there are floods at the same time. So the government's idea and is that if you interlink these rivers, then you can manage these water resources better. But I think that's a huge waste of money, because the glaciers are receding every year. Global warming is making sure that is reducing the flow of rivers. Then another issue is that you're also growing India also has a large electricity demand, right? And we want to shift to hydropower projects from thermal energy. I think I've told you, no, I haven't. But if you look at this, let's say, so if you look at electricity in India, right, 60% of electricity in India is produced from coal. So next time when you're thinking of buying an electric vehicle, it is very likely that bijli that you're getting running the electric vehicle from is coming from a coal plant where some coal is actually being burned. So you're not really doing that much for the environment, right? So India also wants to shift from 60% electricity coming from thermal power plants to other more renewable sources of energy, and hydroelectricity is one of the best bets. Now, the issue with hydroelectricity is that if you build dams on these rivers, then the water flow is anyways going to be reduced, and there are also a lot of ecological consequences to linking these rivers. So I suggest that instead of thinking of these grand ideas, what people should focus on is that they should look at local level management, such as have just say like emphasis should be given on reviving local ponds, wells, and investing in small watersheds so that irrigation can be maintained better. And I think it is the right time for India to take these steps today, because there is a migrant worker crisis. There is absolute joblessness right now in the society. There are a lot of people, hardworking laborers, who migrated back to their homelands, right? And they left these homelands because in the first place, agriculture could not provide adequate livelihoods from them, right? So agriculture was bad. Therefore, they left these homelands to work as laborers in other states. Now, when these laborers have come back, and when there is general glut in the economy, one of the ways to revive the economy is through government spending, right? Now, I believe that if the government tries to spend through Manrega, then I think it hits two birds with a stone. You provide employment to these people in these harsh times. You give them some money in their hands. The moment you give them some money in the hand, they will start going to the market. They will start purchasing goods. Then it will restart the economy. So one is this angle. And while you're doing this, you also make sure that a lot, like more than 33.9% of the area in your country comes under irrigation, and therefore agricultural productivity could be better. So you can save these migrant laborers from hunger. You can improve agriculture in India, and it also helps you to go towards the aim of doubling farmers income by 2020 or 2022, whenever you plan it to be. Okay, so this was another issue. Then an obvious issue is with regards to the declining size of average farm holding, right? So let's say in 1950s, I had 100 acres of land, but and in 1950s, the fertility rate in India in some of the states was very high. So let's say I had 5 sons. Now I don't have money to educate these sons. I'm anyways a poor farmer. So what do? When I die, I give my land to these 5 sons. Now all my 5 sons just have 20 acres of land. So let's say I at least had 1 acre of land, and I had to feed, let's say, me, my wife, my parents. So that's 4 people, and these 5 sons. So I had to feed 9 people. But now these sons, they have their wife, then they have their children, and they only have their 20 acres of land. So obviously, because of the diminishing size of land, there is a term in economics known as the economy of scale. So the larger your business operation is, you are able to save on certain costs because of the monstrosity of your enterprise, and that is where you make profits, right? So now I don't see how these people can make profits, because their land holdings are reduced to 20 acres, and now these kids also have 3-4 sons more. So in the next generation, you'll probably have someone with a land holding of 5 acres, 6 acres, and it's not going to make a lot of economic sense, right? So that is another issue. So a lot of you might be thinking right now that then there's an easy solution to this. These people can sell these lands. These people can migrate to the cities. Well, the answer is no, because there are certain well-intended policies, right? Let's which the government came up with, which served their purpose in the 60s and the 70s. But right now, these specific policies are preventing these farmers to sell their land, right? So let's say there is someone who decides that मेरे पापा तो 100 एकड़ पे खेती करते थे, उनका काम चल रहा था, but now I have 20 acres of land और मेरा काम नहीं चल रहा. If I want to exit as a farmer, it is very sad that the state does not provide me an exit option, right? So farmers cannot exit farming in India today. So I'll tell you why exactly. Now, since I've talked about it, let's skip these 2-3 slides. I'll come back to these slides later. Now let's look at the freedom of choice that the state is denying to these farmers, right? So the primary issue that I have with with agriculture in India is of over-regulation. Now the thing is, people are very ignorant about this, because, for example, if I ask you today in this video, if I ask you what do you think is the most over-regulated sector in the Indian economy, you'd be quick to say, oh, banking and finance, insurance, etc. But you will be surprised that every aspect of agriculture is controlled, right from credit to land to inputs like water, seeds, and even the markets of agriculture are regulated, right? So there is an act called the APMC Act, under which the first sale by the farmer has to be made in that particular mandi only. So the farmer has no choice in terms of capital. Then B, he can't sell his land. Then C, he can't sell his fruits and vegetables the way he wants to. So these over regulations are crippling these farmers, and I'll try to discuss these sort of over regulations with you right now. So so what over regulation, so the reason why there is over regulation is that because at the time of independence, it is true, the average Indian farmer was illiterate, and there were a lot of predatory, let's say, people and policies and organizations that the government had to protect these farmers from. But now I think it's 2020, the farmer is also educated. A large section of the farmers are educated. These farmers want to try something new, but because of the restrictive policies that might have served their purpose in, let's say, 1940s and 1950s and 60s, in the sense that they protect farmer from these shady smart urban people. Now is the time when we need to accept the fact that these farmers are not children, they are not naive, they are adults, and they have agency. We need to give them this freedom to make these choices, right? So the reason why this happens is because of this sort of ivory tower elitist approach that we have to policy making. So the people who are making agricultural policy in India for the last 30, 40 years, they have absolutely nothing to do. Like there's an anecdote that a friend of mine shared with me. So this guy was working with some government agency, and he had gone to a field to discuss matters of, let's say, to gain inputs from the farmers because they wanted to frame some sort of farming policy for these people. Now the farmer asked this, a young friend of mine, same age, 27 years old, and the farmer asked him a very simple question. This is in Haryana. He's like, छोरे ये बता दे, मूंगफली जो होती है वो जमीन के नीचे होती है, जमीन के ऊपर होती है. And my friend, who was supposed to draft and give suggestions on policies regarding farming, उसे ये नहीं पता कि मूंगफली जमीन के ऊपर होती है, जमीन के नीचे होती है. And these sort of people are drafting policies for these farmers, and that's where the problem is stemming from. So this is one anecdotal example which clearly points out that the people who are responsible for drafting and forming these policies really don't have an idea as to what is going on at the ground level. Okay, so now with regards to, so as I told you, right, even if the farmer, let's say, who now has 20 acres of land, he wants to quit, but he can't, because so the thing is, a lot of states have passed this law that you can't sell agricultural land for non-agricultural purposes, right? And that's where that's where there's a huge problem, right? Because let's say I can't sell this land and move out, because who will buy land? Only farmers can buy this land. Now think about this. I am a farmer. I want to quit because farming is not making me money. How do you expect that there will be other farmers in this same system and this economy who have the money to buy my land? So obviously nobody has the money to buy that agricultural land as well. So the market prices of these agricultural land are very sad. Like sad is actually the word that I'll use for it. Now, the way that someone can sell this land is that first they go to some government officer, then they get the land use pattern changed in the revenue records, and only then they can sell this land. But obviously a farmer who is having difficulty to survive does not have the contacts to make sure that this large process can be held without paying huge bribes. Now the issue with this is that it's not that the agricultural land is not being used for industrial purposes, right? The government of India will come in, they will buy land from these farmers at agricultural rates. Then they will change the land use pattern on the certification of this agricultural land to industrial land. And then they will sell this industrial land to large industries and make a lot of money. So if you had followed the news, the alleged DLF scandal wherein Robert Watra was involved was basically this, that he had purchased agricultural land from a lot of small farmers. Okay, and the allegation was that after he purchased the land from these small farmers, he got, because obviously he got the land use pattern changed, and then the land was then classified as industrial / real estate land, and then this land was sold off to realtors and industries, and a large profit was made. Now this is the problem, right? Let's say I'm a farmer and I want to quit, मेरे को नहीं करनी 20 एकड़ में खेती, I maybe want to start a business in the city, I maybe want to become an entrepreneur. Now banks won't give me any loan, because the reality of loans is that देखो, so for loans you need two things. You have to first of all give the purpose of the loan, and second of all you have to have a valid collateral for this loan, right? So now the problem with agriculture is the banks also know that agricultural land can only be sold to other farmers. And now the banks know that if this farmer is coming to me for a loan and the collateral is this piece of land, the banks are also really not interested in giving this land, right? Let's say I am a bank, I loan you 100 rupees, and tomorrow you're not able to pay me this money. So now your land might be worth 100 rupees, but as a bank, where do I find the farmer to sell it to? Is there going to be a farmer who will be willing? And the sort of social cohesion that exists in the farmer community, let's say, so we are looking at it from a very urban perspective, right? Now let's go back to the villages. There's a sense of community over there. So let's say I am a bank, I have lent money to someone. Now I confiscate his lands and I now say this land is up for sale. Now let's say his land is right in the middle of the village. It is surrounded by villagers' land. Now the villagers decide that ये तो अपना बंदा है, हो गई इससे problem. We don't want to buy this land. What does the bank do right now? No industrialist is going to come and buy agricultural land in the middle of the village. Nobody from some other village will come and buy land which is surrounded by villagers' land here. So the only people who can buy this land are the villagers in that particular village, and they decide that they don't want to buy the land. So obviously then the banks have less of an incentive, because the banks also know that agricultural land can only be sold for agriculture purposes, and the banks think that in case that this farmer goes bankrupt, there is nothing that I have, this collateral that I might have on paper, it's of no value to me because I can't realize the cost of the loan. So this is one issue. Okay. Then another issue is that as per the land records, if the farmer is recognized as a landholder, then the state does not allow him to sell off all his land, right? So the idea behind this was very good. The state realized that देखो लॉ एक चीज होती है and social pressures are different, right? So let's say in the 60s 50s, when they had started abolishing zamindari, the state realized that it is very possible that once we've captured this land from the zamindars and we've given to the landless farmers who used to work for the zamindars, it is very likely that using his social clout, etc., the zamindar might be able to get this land back from these people. So the state said that if you're on record, if you're a landed farmer, then I will not allow you to, let's say, become landless. Now it is a very good step from the state at that point of time, because this was the sort of issue that I explained to you. This was what the thought was behind this. But now those practices have evaporated. Now let's say I'm someone who's left with 5 acres of land out of my grandfather's 100 acres. Now I can't sell this land because as per the land revenue records, I am a landed farmer, and the law itself prevents me from becoming a landless farmer. So now this is also a big issue that I have. So I don't have an exit option. Now I can't take a loan from the bank for any other purpose, because the bank knows that if the business, if any, let's say I take a loan for an enterprise, I want to run my own business, the banks won't give me the loan, right? Because the banks will say, A, you're a farmer. We have no idea whether you can be a successful entrepreneur or not. And if you're not a successful entrepreneur, what will I do with agriculture, 5-acre agriculture land in the middle of a village? And most of the land will belong to your chacha, taya, and your cousins anyway. So they might not want to buy the land from the banks, and the banks pretty much not going to be able to do anything. And so this is one issue with over-regulation. 1 second. Now, because of this, there is a dual burden on the farmer, right? Because the farmers can't exit, the farmers can't, let's say, have corporations come in, because initially, like, government did not want corporatization of the agriculture as well, because they believed that the corporates might loot the farmers. Bhole bale farmers ko, they might be able to misguide. Could have made sense in the 1950s, but things on the ground are very different today, right? So they didn't allow corporatization of agriculture, and because of that, and because of, let's say, land fragmentation, the farmers were deprived of benefits of scale. Okay? And now what is happening is that the farmers are being forced to be a good farmers, and at the same time they are supposed to be excellent entrepreneurs as well, right? So there is this dual burden on the farmers that is being created by state policies. एक तो आप खेती बड़े अच्छे से करो, उसके बाद you be such a good entrepreneur and a manager and a marketer that you are able to make money out of this as well, right? So this is an additional pressure that is being put on the farmers, this dual burden. Now some steps are being taken, because now contract farming is legalized. Farmer producing organizations can now come up. So basically farmer producing organizations are like cooperatives. Let's say you have Amul, which is a milk cooperative, where a lot of people who produce milk in a certain area give it to some vendor and they give it to Amul, and then Amul uses the economies of scale and makes product. Similarly, farmer producer organizations have come up, okay, which, and now they can take the nature of a company or a society as well in law. So some steps are being taken here. But coming back to the issue of dual burden, now you have a dual burden to be a farmer and an entrepreneur. Obviously, most of the farmers are not going to be able to do this. Now, let's say out of 100 farmers, there is one very smart guy who does both. He becomes a very good farmer and he also becomes a very good entrepreneur, which means that he's running his business successfully. He has money. So now he wants to expand his business. But now comes in the beautiful Land Ceiling Act of 1972. The purpose of the Land Ceiling Act was amazing. You can't have land beyond certain acres, because otherwise how will we abolish zamindari system? But now let's say there is a person in the market who's a great entrepreneur. He's cracked the game. He knows how to farm and make money. So he can't buy land from other farmers because they can't become landless on record. Then even if he's able to buy some land from these farmers, he can't legally own land more than X acres. This is decided by every state. So let's say state of Punjab decides hypothetically that no one can own more than 50 acres of land. Now I'm an entrepreneur. I started with 5 acres of land. Now I have 45 acres of land. I am making good money. Now I want to expand, but I can't because the Land Ceiling Act says that I can't have more than 50 acres of land. So in spite of the fact that of this excessive burden on me, मैं बड़ी मुश्किल से, if I have succeeded also, then I can't expand. So the benefits of scale are now being denied to me as well, right? So it is very interesting that such land ceiling laws on capital, see, in agriculture, land is the capital, right? So these land ceiling laws don't exist anywhere. For example, corporations today can raise money from the international markets, and recently there was an issue of sovereign bonds where government of India itself wanted to raise credits from overseas. Now there is a government which today says that I am willing to make sure that the corporate sector can raise money overseas. I myself might want to raise money overseas, but the farmers can't raise any money overseas. Farmers ko we will place absolute restrictions with the only form of capital that the farmers have, which is land. Okay, so this is an issue that plagues farmers in India. Then there is an issue of inefficient production. Now, this issue of inefficient production is linked with the MSP regime and the sort of subsidies that are given and the sort of politics that works around farmer lobbies, etc. Right? And as I told you, Punjab is an arid piece of land. Rice should not be growing there, but because of MSPs that are provided by the government of Punjab, which is at the behest of the rich, powerful farmers in Punjab, and the farming lobby in Punjab is very strong. So they provide good MSP for rice. So in spite of the fact that Punjab should ideally not grow rice, because rice should be grown in areas where there is water, right? Punjab is practically undergoing desertification. There are multiple issues that Punjab is facing with regards to depletion of water tables, salinization of soil. All of that specifically can be pointed out to rice. But because of the sort of skewed political nature of these crops, the government has no other option. Okay. Now, one issue, just let's focus specifically on the example of Punjab. I'm sure similar examples are prevailing in other states. So the government of Punjab cannot remove the subsidy. Now, the second thing is Punjab is that since the farmer lobby is very strong, the government of Punjab gives basically free electricity to the farmers. Now, the issue with giving free electricity to the farmers is the farmers now realize that I have free electricity. I can keep my tube well or bore well running for 24 hours a day. I can take out as much water from underground, and I can deplete the water table, because kya hi farak pad raha hai, this bijli is free. So there is no incentive for the farmer to even switch off the pump and not need it. So a lot of water is that way is going wasted. And the issue is that if, let's say, tomorrow there's a government in Punjab which says that from tomorrow you'll have to pay money for electricity, then the government doesn't exist after 5 years. So that's another issue. Now the government came up with this policy because it wanted to, let's say, help the farmers by saying that, oh, use electricity, it might increase your income, but now this is being misused. And if the government also realizes that this is being misused, but the fact is that it's a very emotive issue, right? It's very hard for a government to now come and say that, oh, ab se bijli free nahi, you have to pay for it, because then there are certain political issues with that. So then you have ecological problems like this. And now another interesting thing, we are all aware of the sort of pollution that Delhi faces, right? So Punjab mein rice ug raha hai. The way that you harvest rice is that 5 to 6 inches of rice is left after being harvested. Now the easiest way to get rid of this is called parali in local Punjabi, is to burn it. Now, when you burn this parali, there are winds, western disturbances which come from Mediterranean Sea, etc., and they are flowing towards Delhi. Now, they will carry all of this pollution to Delhi. And now you have Himalayas on this side, which blocks all the pollution there. So you have an influx of pollutants into Delhi, and Delhi can't do anything about it because the state of Punjab cannot incentivize its farmers from producing rice. So this is another unintended consequences that people of this country have been facing because of the sort of agricultural stances and policies that India has taken, right? Now, similarly, you have a problem of sugarcane in Maharashtra. Sugarcane, again, is an extremely water intensive crop. Okay. Now, Maharashtra also has a lot of dry regions. So therein also a lot of sugarcane is grown, and India is exporting rice to, let's say, Iran. India is also exporting sugarcane. So India is now becoming a net exporter of water. अब ऐसा नहीं है that we have so much water that we can export water. We ourselves have a large scarcity of water. However, in spite of that, because of the political economy surrounding these crops, India is now becoming a net exporter of water. So this is another unintended consequence of the sort of policies that the Indian state has taken up. Okay. Now, let's talk about the issue of availability of credit. So the issue of availability of credit can be linked with the sort of laws, let's say, I explained to you the banking problem, right? So banks will give you loan if you can give them collateral. So the only collateral that you can give them is agricultural land. And the banks know that there's no point in taking agricultural land as collateral because who will I sell it to? So the banks are not willing to loan to these people. So now these people have to fall back on the money lenders and the traditional money lenders that exist in the villages. Now a bank might be giving you an interest loan at an 8, 9, 10, 12% rate. The money lender, he knows that the farmer is coming to me because the bank will not give him a loan. So obviously he's going to charge a premium. Now this premium can be as high as 25, 30%. So that further puts the farmers into a debt trap, right? So statistically speaking, less than half, like around 47, 48% of the farmers actually get loans from formal sources. Most of the other loans are from money lenders, aratyas, etc. And that's also creating a large problem. And even when these loans are given from a formal source, these are given for short-term loans, right? So these are loans on the crop, and the crop is a collateral, right? So collateral might be land, but so loans, the way that you take loans also is that I can't go to the bank and say, please give me 100 rupees to do X and then do Y with it. Okay. So there are certain end use requirements that I have to meet when I go to a bank. So let's say I go to a bank and say, मुझे crops के लिए loan दे दो. Then I can't use that money to make capital, like to make a pond in my field, right? I can't use that money to dig an irrigation canal. I have to use the loan for a specific purpose only, right? So the banks were also willing and gambling on the fact that, okay, let's give a short term 6 month loan because 6 months बाद crop cycle आएगा and then we will take the money back from him. So the banks are also not willing to give long term loans, and because long term investments are anyways not being provided by either the private sector or the public sector, so the general agriculture infrastructure in the country is left lacking. So I think if you followed the news a couple of years ago, there were a large number of tribal farmers who had walked into Pragati Maidan in Bombay, right? And they wanted to, let's say, protest. So a very interesting issue is that the media sort of try to skew that issue and say, oh, all of these people who have walked in, they want to demand these, as in they are walking here for farm loan waivers, right? But these people, if you look at the interview from the ground level, these people don't want don't want farm loan waiver, because anyways most of these people have taken, if they have taken loan, they have taken loans from informal sources. So if the government of India says that I'm going to give a farm loan waiver, it doesn't affect most of the farmers, right? It only affects the rich farmers who had the capital and who had the resources and the contacts to get money from the formal sector. So it does not affect, then who are the farmers who get money from the informal sector? These are the poorest of the poor farmers, right? The socially downtrodden. So when the government says that I'm going to give a loan waiver, the farmers at the bottom rung of this entire system have no benefit out of it, right? So all these tribal farmers that had come to Pragati Maidan, their issue was not loan waiver, etc. They basically said that under Forest Rights Act, a patta is issued, which basically gives them entitlement to the forest land that their tribes had been ancestrally using. So the main demand was that. So the farmer in India has consistently been trying to tell the government that we don't need you, please don't come in, right? So there's a very interesting and charismatic farmer leader, Mr. Sharad Joshi ji. He was a civil servant and then he quit and then he became a farmer. So he basically outlined and he basically gave this quote that the government is not the solution, the government is the problem. And he says the sort of policies that the government is taking, the sort of interventions that the government is making, the sort of, let's say, paternalistic and patronizing attitude that the government has adopted. Oh, we need to protect these farmers, liberalization, agriculture mein nahi ho sakta, ye to bechare lut jayenge. So Sharad Joshi and people from that school of thought are saying, let us be open to competition. We don't want your support. We want you to get lost. We don't want your intervention at all, right? So a lot of farmers are consistently be making these demands. And because of the things that I explained to you, I think it's fairly understandable also why farmers would think that government is not the solution, and government is actually creating a lot of problems for these farmers. Okay, so this was the issue of availability of credit. Now, another thing that I want to touch about is the lack of freedom of choice and genetically modified foods, right? So India was not allowing genetically modified foods, right? So in around 2003, 2004, this is called as the BT cotton satyagraha, right? So what happened was, this seed had come into the market, unregulated seed called BT cotton. This was basically a genetically modified form of cotton which was pest resistant. Now, it had been illegally planted by a lot of farmers in Punjab, Maharashtra, and Akola district of Maharashtra, especially. Okay. And the government was not giving any sort of approval for these GM foods. Now, then suddenly there was a crisis in the sense that the bollworm pest struck. Okay. And a large quantity of cotton crops in the country was destroyed. Now, the only cotton crop that was left standing was the GM variety of crop that had been illegally planted by the farmers, right? So then there was a lot of pressure on the Vajpayee government, and then they relented and they gave approval to 2 generations of BT cotton. Okay. So now the same thing is happening again. There is a third generation of BT cotton called HTBT. This is herbicide tolerant BT cotton. Okay. So as the name suggests, it so the problem with cotton is that it's a very highly labor intensive crop. Okay, it's a commercial crop, it has a good price, I get all of that, but it is a highly labor intensive crop, and you have to remove the weed from the field by hand, and that costs money because you have to hire a lot of labor. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of farmers are quitting cotton growing. So this solution came up in the form of generation 3 BT cotton seeds called the HTBT cotton, which is resistant to herbicide. So now you don't have to pluck out herbicide from the ground. You can just spray herbicides in the ground and the herbs will die, but the cotton will be resistant to it. Now, again, the government is not giving approvals for this HTBT cotton. A lot of farmers have illegally started planting out. I think in 2017, the government report also has been sanctioned in this regard, but the results have not been made public, but media sources say that about 15 to 16% of the cotton that is being growing in India belongs to the generation 3 HTBT. Now, this is being termed by the cotton farmers as a sort of satyagraha, right? Because satyagraha was what people. So British government had said that you can't produce salt, and Gandhiji said no, everybody is producing salt. It's not that Gandhiji was the first person to produce salt. People had been doing it in their backyards. People had been doing it at their homes, right? But Gandhiji said that I have to make a mark of defiance, and this is something that everyone has been doing, and people had a sort of criminal mindset towards this in the sense that they thought that they were breaking this law, right? So similar thing applied to these cotton farmers. They started calling this cotton grow variety as chor BT cotton, right? Because they felt that wo chori kar rahe hain and they are going against the state. So this was a sort of satyagraha where some farmers said, nahi, mujhe farak nahi padta, I am going to draw BT cotton, and then they fought and the government had to relent in. So therefore this was termed as the BT cotton satyagraha. So now the second satyagraha is going on with regards to generation 3 cotton. Now the interesting thing is that globally fourth generation BT cotton is being used, and India sees only 15% of generation 3 HTBT cotton. Okay. Now same is the story with BT brinjal. It got all the necessary approvals in 2009, but now it's been 11 years and it's not being planted here. Okay. So I think the scientific community is fairly clear. I think a couple of years ago, 100 Nobel laureates wrote an open letter to the world community wherein they said that there are absolutely no harms of these genetically modified crops, and all of these oppositions are unscientific. And billions of meals have been served all across the world without any sort of harms being reported, right? So now Bangladesh, India is not approving BT brinjal, but Bangladesh has been growing BT brinjal, and Bangladesh has been really doing well because the quality of brinjal that is being produced in Bangladesh is good and it's getting good global prices. Okay. Now, same is the issue with GM mustard. And herein is the hypocrisy. So the government is not allowing GM mustard, even though both BT brinjal and GM mustard have been created by Indian companies. Okay. BT brinjal is created by some Mahiko, Maharashtra based government think tank, etc. And GM mustard is IT Delhi, I think, has put in some inputs here. So these are all homegrown technologies, but the government is not allowing this. But at the same time, Canada grows genetically modified mustard. And so an Indian farmer today who has traditionally been growing mustard for the last 3,000-4,000 years, like for the last 400-500 years, cannot grow genetically modified mustard because the government says it is unsafe. But Canadian mustard, which is genetically modified, usse there is canola oil that is extracted from it, and India can freely import that. So you see the irony here, right? The Indian farmers cannot grow GM mustard, but if a farmer in Canada is growing GM mustard, we will purchase oil from them. So this is a sort of another sort of problem that Indian farmers are deliberately, either deliberately or by systemic design, are being denied this free choice. Okay.
Just to sorry.
Then there is a way. Yeah.
It's just that I wanted to know how many slides are there, if you don't mind, because there is a technical requirement.
Yeah, are we out of time?
No, we are absolutely on time. It's 4:45. It's just that there is a technical team requirement.
Okay.
Want to test something urgently. So they've requested us, and I just wanted to know how many slides are there so that we could either cut it into 2 parts and maybe do another one tomorrow.
Okay, so there are three more slides.
Okay, great. So, but then they look quite exhaustive and interesting to me, because we can't do justice, just rushing through them. And how much time would you really need to, what do you say? 5 minutes?
So I think I need another 7 to 8 minutes.
I will just maybe 5. Sorry. Okay. You will just 5 minutes. Let's try, and because then we'll not have any time for the questions at all. And I see that same people who've been there right from the start, they're still around because they find the topic very interesting, I'm sure. So my apologies to the people attending this webinar. It's sudden, and it's very, suddenly I've received 2-3 messages on here and on the phone. So I'm sorry. Chalo, let's continue. Let's continue and close this. Yeah. Maybe they can ask questions on you.
Let me just try to.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. I'll try to wrap it up quickly then. Okay.
Sorry.
So then there is a major issue. No issue. Then there's a major issue with the APMCs and middlemen. Okay. So APMCs are the agricultural produce marketing committees. Okay. So Sharad Joshi had a very nice couplet in Hindi, which I want to reiterate here, which highlights the predicament of the farmers and the consumers, right? So Sharad Joshi, from the perspective of a farmer, says, हम भी मर रहे हैं, तुम भी मर रहे हो, हम सस्ता बेच के मर रहे हैं और तुम महंगा खरीद के मर रहे हो. Okay, so effectively it says that most of the money that is being made out of agriculture is not made by the farmers. This money is made by the plethora of middlemen that the state has allowed to thrive. Okay, so APMCs, which stands for Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees, are a relic of the 70s. Now here again, APMCs were very important at that point of time, because it was thought that a lot of these local level arhatyas and the village goons, sort of traders, etc., they were exploiting the farmers. They didn't allow farmers to have an effective price discovery. They didn't let farmers know ki market mein kya rate hai, and they were purchasing stuff from the farmers in the first place. So the state came in, and in 1970s, so the central government gave directions, and since agriculture is a state subject, a lot of states also came in, and they passed their respective APMC acts. Okay, so what the APMC Act does is that its purpose effectively was to ensure that these farmers are not exploited by these traders, and there is a government institution wherein the first sale would take place, right? So the farmers were forced to sell their products in the APMCs. So initially it worked out. Farmers realized, that these traders are robbing us. Let's say if they were buying stuff for 5 rupees, now we are able to sell the same stuff in these mandis for 10 rupees. But what the governments didn't realize is that they were creating this sort of monopoly, right? So let's say monopoly is when there is only one seller, and that seller can then distort prices. So the exact opposite of monopoly in economics is monopsony, which means that there is only one buyer. So initially there might have been traders which were exploiting the farmers, but there was some sort of competition with these farmers, right? So some within these traders as well. So farmers are getting some semblance of a reasonable price. Over the years, these traders and arhatyas, they basically occupied all the positions in the APMCs. Now, what has effectively happened is that the state has institutionalized this sort of exploitation. So initially the traders were using traditional methods. Now they have the full force and the sanction of the states to exploit these farmers. Okay. So the main issue is that the APMC acts, they basically compel the farmer to make sure that the first sale is only in these mandis. Okay, and the only exception is that if the farmer sells to the consumer directly, And like, think about it, how many farmers actually go and sell to the consumers directly, right? So these farmers are supposed to sell off their goods in these APMCs, right? And now the APMCs are structured in this in such a way that they eliminate competition among middlemen, right? So let's say if the sort of if let's say APMCs are let's say reformed in a way, then it will benefit both the farmers and the consumers as well, right? Let me give a very simple example. Like with the APMC structure in place, with a lot of middlemen there, farmers are selling, let's say, a good at 2 rupees a kg. And then it goes through the APMCs where multiple fees are levied, there is no competition, farmers are exploited, etc. So they sell it for 2 rupees. And the end consumer, that is me, I buy that same fruit or vegetable for 20 rupees. Now, let's say if you are able to bring reforms in the APMCs and eliminate this extra money, the farmer can now sell this for 10 bucks. Okay. The middleman can make 2-3 rupees, which is adequate for the amount of work that they put in. And me as a consumer can now buy this for 12 rupees. So effectively, there's an 8 rupee profit to the farmer, there's an 8 rupee saving for the consumer, and the middleman also, in a way, get their fair share. So it's not that these middlemen are evil people, but it's just that the structure is such that there are no incentives for them to compete with each other. And if there are no incentives, then obviously the middlemen are not going to compete within the APMCs. So that is one problem here. Now the next problem is with regards to the Essential Commodities Act. Okay. So Essential Commodities Act is a successor of the British wartime regulations, which was which was passed to ensure that the supply of goods essential to the war effort could be controlled and there would be no hoarding, etc. Right? So the intention of the ECA was this, and the Indian state also put in the ECA. Now, with the problem with ECA is that the Essential Commodities Act gives the government the control over storage and sale price of any good, which is included in a list of these commodities. Okay. So all the food items, including oil seeds, etc., included in the list. Now the problem with the list is that there is a principle of delegated legislation. So the parliament didn't decide what will be there in the list. It's the state executive and the bureaucrats who will decide that what will be the goods that are placed in these lists, right? So it didn't come from a primary source, and it's basically the bureaucrats who will decide, and the ministers, etc., who the executive basically who will decide which are the goods that can be placed here, right? So the problem here is that now the ECA delegates this out to the executive at the center and the states, and then they set the prices through detailed delegated legislation, which are called control orders. Okay, so this basically means that there is no discussion or deliberative process for any sort of restrictions to come in. So sort of there is some sort of arbitrariness in the sense that the government can put in any commodity under the list in Essential Commodities Act, and it can give directions to traders. So it can force traders to sell, and sometimes these orders are made overnight. Ek din mein order aata hai, by tomorrow you have to sell all of these things. Okay, so one of the largest problems that India faces with agriculture is that there are lack of adequate storage facilities, right? So because there are no storage facilities, farmers can't store their sort of semi-perishable material, and if the markets are bad, farmers can't store it, and the farmers are forced to sell it at a lower price, right? Now if there was adequate storage in place, the farmers could obviously then store these food products and sell it at a later rate when the market prices would revive. Now the reason why there is no good infrastructure, it can be effectively looked at from this perspective, that since the Essential Commodities Act creates the sort of system wherein any sort of arbitrary executive order could be made. Now no private sector investor is going to invest in warehouses, right? Now let's say I'm a private sector investor, I construct a warehouse, okay, and let's say I put in 1000 kgs of apples or wheat there, and I'm thinking I will sell this at a later date when the market is good. Now the government comes in and says, no, there is some sort of an emergency. As in, you have to sell all your goods by tomorrow. So where will the person who was running these warehouses make money, right? And now let's say, and most of the how businesses work is this person will not put all of his own capital. He'll finance it through some debt. So the banks will have to give money to the warehouse. Now the banks also realize that this is not a viable business opportunity, because let's say if the government passes an order and says that you have to vacate your warehouse, this guy has to sell it at a lower price, and then he will not be able to make repayments to the bank. So banks also don't lend money to these warehouses. So people are not willing to put in their own money, banks are not willing to put in money, so the storage infrastructure in India is basically lacking with all of this, right? So this is another issue with the Essential Commodities Act. And finally, I told you that I'll present you with a counterfactual, in the sense that had all of these things been taken care of, and had agriculture been also liberalized in the 1990s with everything else, what is the sort of difference that we could see, right? So in 1991, India and China had comparable GDPs. Only today that China's GDP is 5 times India's GDP, right? And if you look at the history of the world, every country that has liberalized and reaped the benefits of liberalization and globalization, the first step that they took is to liberalize agriculture as well, right? So China struggled all through the 1980s to liberalize agriculture. And mind you, China is a country where the control of the land is with the state. So in spite of the fact that all of the land is owned by the state, China was able to in some way liberalize and open up agriculture. Let's say it freed agricultural trade, then agricultural inputs were deregulated, agricultural pricing, etc. were deregulated, and China transformed its agriculture in those 10 to 15 years, right? Similar is the case with South Korea. South Korea and India are at the same level in 1950s in terms of per capita income, and now South Korea is a part of OECD, which is the 24 richest countries in the world. South Korea liberalized their agriculture, they faced these issues, but within 30-40 years, they came out of it. Similar is the example with New Zealand. New Zealand till the 1980s and 90s was considered to be the laggard of the Western world, right? And then they opened up, they liberalized their agriculture, and the situation today is that New Zealand, which is 10,000 kilometers away from China, sells more milk to China than India, in spite of India having land border to China, right? Because we just don't have the sort of market structures and incentives to promote these business activities. Now, as a result, if you look at it in this context, today China's agricultural GDP is larger than India's actual GDP. Now, this is the sort of difference that agricultural growth in China has made. Okay, so this is something that I'd like to leave you with regards to what you should be thinking about when you look at agriculture cases, etc. And to conclude, I'd say that now India is holding, so we talk about liberalization, we talk about private sector opening up, we talked about having Make in India, but somehow we forget that agriculture is the largest private sector in India, and agriculture is also the largest place where you can have